Jesus says, do you have philos for me? Do you have human love? And Peter responds, and then Jesus says, feed my sheep. That acceptance of God, of human love. We're ordinary people. We come before the Lord in this world, and we're not perfect. We're people of light and darkness. Okay, so that's very important about all the disciples. They have feelings, they have emotions. You know, like today is the feast of St. Thomas the Apostle. Sometimes we call him Thomas the Doubter. He's no more of a doubter than anyone else, except Thomas is quite open in his feelings. And you know, what you see is what you get. He's the one who's going to ask the question about, you know, the elephant in the room. That's Thomas. Very honest. But when you look at the other disciples of the time of Jesus' death and resurrection, they're all bullheaded, close-minded. If you remember the disciples on the way to Emmaus, you know, they're talking about the fact that the women had been in the grave and they'd seen a vision of angels that had announced that Jesus was alive. They didn't believe. They're no better than Thomas. Thomas is just the honest one. And the reason I bring this up is Jesus spent 3 years with them, sharing a message, and ultimately going to his death on the cross. Then there was the resurrection, and Jesus continued to be with them, probably for 40 days. But then there is the ascension. And one of the things when you face the ascension is the disciples had to be grieving. Jesus left them. And this must have been a death experience. You know, we celebrate the ascension, knowing full well everything that it means. But for these 11, when Jesus was gone, they were probably grieving, mourning, hurting, angry. Jesus had left them. Now, Jesus realized he had to leave them. If these 12 were going to take possession of the church, if they were going to realize their call as co-creators with the Lord, he had to leave them. And this is something we all face. This is something we all face where there is the moment when the teacher has to leave. Sometimes I've shared with you is my feelings the first time I ever heard confessions. What we did to study confessions is, for 2 quarters, we would spend 2 hours once a week with a priest. There'd be 5 or 6 of us, and they called it casas. And what the priest would do is, he would say, okay, Paul, I'm going to go to confession to you. And so we had to respond. Then afterwards, we all tore apart our responses. Did we do a good job or a bad job? Okay, so there was a sense. If you made a mistake, it was a learning process. But suddenly, a week after my ordination, I'm going to be hearing confessions for the first time. It's scary because I had no idea. And yet I had to do it. And one of the things that I remember is towards the end of confessions, my very first time, I had a man come in, and suddenly, you would never know this, I'm changing enough so that you can never follow through. And he said, Father, I robbed a store. I needed some money, and I robbed a store. So I said, okay, one of the things is when you steal is restitution. So he said, well, that's why I came to you. I want you to return the money to the store. Well, they never told me. What do you do? I mean, it was just, I said, oh my God. So he said, if you step outside, I have a shopping bag, and inside is $2,800. So I remember stepping outside, and he gave me the bag. Well, there's one thing that in the instructions for priests hearing confession, you can always go to another priest if you need some assistance, providing in no way do you violate the secrecy of the confession. Okay. It was late in the evening. It was around 9 o'clock. And I know one priest happened to be leaving. He may have seen somebody giving me the shopping bag. I don't know who it was. So I can't ask anyone because that's a violation. So I just remembered, okay, what do I do? So I went, got all dressed, got in my clerics, and went down to the local sheriff's department. And scary as hell, because this one sergeant started really to push me into a corner. What was the name? What was involved? Well, if you know me, I was rather nervous until you do that to me when then I get stubborn as hell. And I was not about to answer anything. And then finally, a wonderful captain came in, an Irishman, graduate of Holy Cross College in Worcester, and he told the sergeant, get lost. I'll take care of this. And so he said, Father, no one's going to arrest you. And he says, I could just see it ending up in the newspaper with my Irish mother, that on my call, this priest had been arrested. He said, I would never hear the end of it. But anyway, for the disciples, one of the things we got to realize is they're suddenly in charge. And right at the beginning, they can say, what do we do? Jesus didn't leave them a roadmap saying, okay, now you are to establish priests, bishops, parishes. He showed them how to love, and that's where he left them. And if I can share something, they began to realize the gift of the Spirit. That gift of the Spirit that called them together. Now, there's two stories of a Pentecost. You have the story in Luke, which is very theological, of the Spirit descending and really empowering them. In John, the gift of the Spirit is given on that Easter Sunday. When Jesus first appears to the disciples, he goes in the inner room and he breathes on them and says, I give you the Spirit. Okay. One of the things is the disciples began to realize, though Jesus had left them, they began to realize there was a Spirit that empowered them. And if I can share something, as we look at what we've been having to do during this coronavirus thing, as we ended up with a whole new chapter that no one had ever really felt we had to do. As priest of St. Ignatius, suddenly I remember that Wednesday when it was decided there were not going to be any Sunday masses. We got together. Travis, John, Greg, and I. What do we do? And we really just sat down and we said, okay, let's do about 10 minutes of silence, asking for the grace of the Lord. Then gradually we started to talk after 10 minutes. And we began to just figure out, what could we do? And what we found out is the Spirit led us. So that we started our televised masses. Again, not perfect, but how many people have really been touched by those masses? You know, when you can't go to church, I mean, you know, we've had generally 1,100 links on every Sunday Mass. And how much just out of our imagination, but guided by the Spirit, did we do something? You know, something to fill the void, some way that we could really bring Jesus to people. That's the Spirit. That's the Spirit guiding us. You know, it didn't come probably to the apostles in a great miracle. It was just that recognition. We have a Spirit leading us, teaching us. And so, as we look at what has happened during this coronavirus, perhaps this can give us a little insight into the very first early moments of the church. As the disciples began to realize, we got to do something. And a lot of it was questions, you know, moments. For instance, the creation of deacons. What the disciples realized is, as the church grew, there were need for people to assist them. And, you know, it came out where the widows, especially of the Greek-speaking, complained that they were being left out. And the disciples realized, hey, we can't handle this. Our major call is to preach the word. So there was a guidance of the Spirit. And so for the first time, they elected and ordained 7 deacons. Again, that Spirit leading the church, opportunity was there. And this is the way the church is going to begin to operate. At the very first beginning, what you find if you read the scriptures, the community would gather in homes, and there they would celebrate the Eucharist. They would read, especially out of the Old Testament. And then they would gather at a table. And there they would break bread. There they would celebrate the Eucharist. But if you read the earlier accounts in Acts, they then also went to the temple to pray. They gathered with their sisters and brothers of the Jewish faith, and they prayed. The original church is very, very Jewish. But gradually, it begins to move. The great movement to Antioch, especially. Antioch becomes a very key city in the early church. In fact, if you read in Acts, it's there at Antioch that this early community is for the first time called Christian. Okay, the church begins to move, and there are controversies where they've got to really gather in prayer. One of the things that you have is, to be a Christian, do you have to be Jewish first? With all the regulations that you have. And this becomes a very momentous decision in the early church. And if you think there are problems that we face with many people with Vatican II, as the church moved and became more and more a Gentile church, it faced problems. So one of the things that you have is circumcision was the great symbol of becoming Jewish. Did people have to be circumscribed? Did they have to accept all the Jewish dietary laws? And what you have is sometimes called the First Council of Jerusalem, where the disciples met. And one of the things, if you read in Galatians, Paul had to stand up to Peter. Paul had to stand up to Peter and say, Peter, you're wrong. What you're demanding of people is not what the Lord wanted. And one of the things that you have is Paul challenged Peter. Peter changed. And the early church decided that no, people did not have to become Jewish. And so they set up the rules for Gentiles. Just avoid meat strangled, meat offered to idols, and that was it. The real movement of the church as it became more and more Gentile, as it listened to the Spirit. And so what you have is Paul goes out to the Greek communities, especially Asia Minor and in Greece, and he preaches, and he brings them into the church. Eventually, Paul is taken to Rome, where he once again encounters Peter, where both of them have moved now to Rome. And the symbol of Rome that's the capital of the known world. Rome is really symbolic. This is the capital of the Roman Empire and the center of the known world. So if the journey of Jesus, and there's a real journey, if the journey of Jesus is to Jerusalem, the head of the Jewish church. So now the Spirit is leading the church, that presence of Jesus on earth, from Jerusalem to the center of the known world. And that's the symbol of Rome. It's the center of the known world. And so it's that universal call that is so important to Jesus Christ. And that's symbolic in the call of the disciples to Rome. Now in Rome, what you're going to find out is both Peter and Paul are going to be martyred. A martyrdom that is, they are simply part of so many other people. Now, the background to martyrdom, and this is something that, once again, in our history and our feelings, if we look at what happened in Nazi Germany, where the Germans really made the Jews scapegoats for all the difficulties in Germany, and they really turned against the Jews. And they managed to carry out this tremendous pogrom. Okay. Rome had been going through a real trial period, starting in the year about 45 BC. There had been a real abrupt change in the weather in that area of Rome. A weather where sometimes the days were 13 degrees colder than was the normal. There were crop failures, there was starvation, there were all kinds of problems. And Rome was very, very unsettled. Then you have the difficulty with the emperors. For a while, there's a very good emperor in Augustus, but his successors are really people that have no sense of their call to serve with justice. And so if you look at the Roman emperors, Tiberius is okay. But then you have Claudius, who's killed. Then you have Caligula, also killed. You have Nero, who kills his predecessor. Nero, who sets up to rebuild the city of Rome. And what happens is he makes a mistake. He sets a fire to one building, a fire that began to consume the whole city of Rome. People were really angry at him, and so what does he do? Who's the scapegoat that he decides on? and they are to be the Christians. And so he starts the first of the persecutions of the Christians. And it's a horrible moment. I mean, some of the stuff that takes place in the martyrdom is really horrible. But he starts to move against the Christian church. And what he invokes very much, and as I say, in our own time, when we look at Hitler, is a sense of one language, one religion, one leader, the Fuhrer. Okay. Nero begins to pull this on the people. And this gives him the freedom to turn against the Christian church and attempt to destroy it. Now, for the most part, in the early church, the Christians were among the poor. Yes, there were some very well-to-do people that joined the church, but for the most part, the people that began to follow Jesus were the poor and the slaves. Because the church gave something to the slaves that they never had, a hope and a peace, and a sense that they were something special. And that's where, and you must remember that in the city of Rome, 60% of the population were slaves. It was overwhelming to be slaves. They were everywhere. And so they, along with the poor, become, basically the beginning of the church. Now, one of the things is a story, for instance, this is later on in the persecutions. Lawrence is the deacon of Rome. And the Romans had raided one of the catacombs where they found the bishop of Rome, the Pope, celebrating Mass. They turned on this Pope and the 8 other assistants, and they killed them immediately. But they knew from spies that Lawrence was the treasurer for the Roman church. So they let him live temporarily. So the governor of Rome says, okay, by Wednesday, 2 more days, I want you to bring all the treasures of your church to me. He wanted to confiscate them. So if you know anything the story of Lawrence, what he does is he shows up with the governor, with the poor, the broken, the crippled, and he says, these are the treasures of the city of Rome. Well, the governor was so ticked off at him that he ordered him to be killed. And this is a story where he ordered him to be roasted on a grate. And if you know anything about whether it's true or not, where Lawrence has once said to the man, okay, turn me over, this side is done. But that was what was happening to the early church. Yet, it continued to grow and flourish and to be there. And during the persecution, there's some very unusual things happen. If anybody knows me at daily Mass, I love Eucharistic prayer too. It's actually the oldest of our Eucharistic prayers. It was written by this man, Hippolytus. And what's very interesting about him is, during the time of persecutions, Hippolytus really fights against 2 popes. One of them is Pontius. And Hippolytus has himself elected as an anti-pope. He's very angry with the 2 popes Pontus, excuse me, I forgot the other one. I'll think about it. But he's very angry because he's a rigorist. And basically, he holds that if anybody during the persecutions had reneged on their faith, that there could be never forgiveness for them. That if they had given up their faith and they had denied the Lord, in the lapsy controversy, Hippolytus said they can never be forgiven. Pontus said, yes, they can. You know, the forgiveness of Jesus is always there. So what happened is, Hippolytus was an anti-pope and had a definite faction of the city of Rome. Well, what happened is, of course, the Roman officials could care less whether they were schismatic or what. So Hippolytus and Pontius are both arrested. And they are sent to the salt mines in Sicily. When you were sent to the salt mines, you went underground and you would never surface again until you died. It was a horrible punishment. You were usually starved and you worked 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. Well, what happened is, Hippolytus ends up right next to Pontius in the salt mines. They are both there. And while there, they become reconciled. You know, they both ask forgiveness from each other, and they are reconciled. And so these two men, who were enemies for so long, are both canonized. You know, and so you do have the feast of St. Hippolytus and Pontius. And Hippolytus, as I say, while he was anti-pope, he wrote what we have. So it dates back to about the year 220. He wrote what we have now is the second Eucharistic Prayer. And I love it. It's the oldest. It's very simple, but I find it very beautiful. And I know John also tends to like it. So you have a church that's under heavy persecution. Not always. During some emperors, there's a time of peace, and the church can flourish. But generally, from the year 64 AD to 310 AD, almost 250 years, the church is basically illegal. Under Roman law, it is illegal. However, one little thing I should say, the Romans put Christians and Jews together. The people that never were persecuted in general were Jewish Christians. Jews had a special status in the Roman Empire. So they generally were not subjects of the persecution. But Gentiles that became Christian were, because they were violating the law of one language, one religion, one leader. And many of them were to suffer throughout the empire. And as I say, some of the persecutions were very, very bloody. Finally, what's going to happen is Constantine becomes the emperor. And Constantine, his mother was St. Helen. So his mother was a convert to Christianity, which is a real big help. And it's St. Helen who supposedly finds the true cross. Constantine eventually is going to give toleration to the Christians. Supposedly, Constantine is fighting against a usurper, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. On the eve of the battle, supposedly Constantine sees a vision in the sky, and it's a cross. And what it says in Latin, in hoc signo vinces, in this sign, you will conquer. And so Constantine wins a battle that he did not expect to win. And immediately after that, he gives the edict of toleration. Now, Constantine is very unusual. He eventually makes Christianity the state religion. But Constantine is never baptized until his deathbed. And so, literally, one day before he dies, Constantine was finally baptized and entered the Christian church. But he is the one, really, who brings toleration in the early years of the 300s, the early years of the 4th century. And then the empire has become Christian. Now, just very quickly, I've been reading a book. It's very short synopses of the popes. And after this period, you really get into problems with the popes. I mean, for instance, I forgot, I think there's 42 popes between 325 and the year 1000. Of these popes, 11 are murdered by other popes or other Catholics. I mean, it's not always a great church. You know, for instance, I remember in the 5th century, one pope says, well, I'll be merciful. So there's two anti-popes. One had really a pope, and so he has them smothered to death. That's his mercifulness. So, you know, one of the things that you learn to do is we love our church. It's not perfect. It's very human. But something that I said in one of the meetings after Mass is the church is holy because it's called together by Jesus Christ. And that holiness will always be there. But the church is also a sinner church because it's made up of human beings. And that's something we always have to expect. You know, as we go through this whole history thing, you're going to find out that the church at times is very human, very limited, yet we're called to love it. And that's really, I mean, that's really the call of all of us, is we love the church, not because it's perfect. We love it because it's holy and called together by Jesus. It's there that we meet the Lord. But we also have to accept the fact it's very, very human. And sometimes all too human, where it really fails. But our call for all of us is somehow to love this very real church. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So if you have questions, you know, wave your hand or unmute yourself. I think you can unmute yourself. And we'll see if we can have some questions. I could unmute everybody, but then that means we have to all be very quiet. I don't know. Should we try that? Sure.
Okay, we'll try that.
Okay. Oh, okay. So you can unmute yourself. I've got that on. So if you want to ask a question, go to the microphone on your screen and click it. Let's see what we have. I don't know how to get it. Does Sherry have a question?
Not at this time.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Yes, Lenore.
Lenore.
I have a question regarding the route that the disciples and their followers would have taken, because you mentioned Antioch, which I assume you're talking about the Antioch that's in Syria.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
So I was looking at a map, and if if you ultimately end up in Rome, you would go through Turkey
Yes.
and then across down to Greece, which would take you through there, and then up in through Croatia maybe, and then head down.
Also, but remember is the shipping that's going on.
Oh, okay.
The
So
Mediterranean has a great deal of shipping going on. And so there would have been boat travel also.
okay. So they
Now,
might not have gone up into Turkey and gone directly.
Paul
over.
definitely went into Turkey.
Okay.
Paul, Paul comes from Tarsus, and Tarsus would be a city in southeastern Turkey today.
Mm-hmm.
But remember, as far as being Turkey, it remains very Greek. The Turks have the first moment of getting into what we call that area only after the year 1100. It's basically a very Greek area.
Uh-huh.
Turks break through the fortifications in 1100, and eventually they're going to conquer all we call Turkey.
Okay. And then I had a question about Sicily, because you mentioned that. The salt mines in Sicily. What part of Sicily would that have been located in?
It's in the southern part.
Okay.
I need a map really to point out, that. Okay,
Yeah, I just wondered about the general area, but that would make sense if they're coming from boats. So
yes.
the southern part, yeah, because it's very Mediterranean, Sicily.
Yes. Okay,
Thank
any
you.
other question for anyone else? Yes, Leonard.
Leonard, you have to unmute yourself.
Oh, okay.
There you
This is Leonard. Father, you mentioned that initially the church was a Jewish church. It was, I guess you would say, St. Paul who made it a Gentile church.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you could expand on that, because he did not stay in Jerusalem. He was definitely moving through the empire, primarily Greece, and converting to Christianity Gentiles.
Yes.
And it was Paul who became instrumental. Without Paul, we would not have a Gentile church, is what I'm saying.
Well, there were other disciples that went out also. Paul was the most visible. See, it's not just Paul that goes to the Gentile world. Paul is the most visible. And now remember, Paul is a Jew and a Pharisee. He was trained, he's a Greek he's a citizen of Rome. He's born in Tarsus, which is an imperial city. He's born to Jewish parents. He's a Pharisee. Then he goes to Jerusalem to study. But Paul is primarily the one that we see, especially because of his letters. But remember that many others went into that same area to preach. Luke, Mark, he's not the only one.
But they were affiliated with Paul, and
not all of them. I mean,
okay.
Not all of them were affiliated with Paul. Others made their own journeys. For instance, James probably goes to Spain on his own and is going to preach there and be principal there for the conversion of Spain. Does that help you?
Yeah, I know the other apostles. There's an apostle supposedly who went to India.
Yeah.
There was an apostle that not only the Pauline church, but there was also apostles in Syria, which has the oldest, I think, Armenian church, which is the oldest Christian church outside of Israel.
Yeah.
So I know that they did. But Paul was instrumental. Without Paul, I don't know if we would have had a Gentile church.
Okay, there's no way I can prove or disprove that.
Okay.
go. Thanks, Leonard.
Yes.
Who else?
Yes. Karen?
So, hello, Father Paul. This is Helene Rosenthal. I used to come to your early morning mass, and I'd like to tell you I miss you and I thank you for all you are doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.
Yes.
Okay. Karen?
Hi, Father. Thank you so much for this presentation. It's really very rich for me. I was just wondering if the apostles in Jerusalem, Greece, Syria, any other places in addition to Rome, if they were persecuted and martyred also?
Generally, we don't know. The ancient tradition is all the apostles died a martyrdom's death except for St. John. That's an ancient tradition. We really don't know too much about them. You have the ancient traditions and fables. We don't know too much. But from the earliest days, the church has always accepted the fact that only John was the only one who did not die a martyr's death.
Thank you.
And remember that places, the important places in the East were going to end up Antioch, Alexandria, then eventually with Constantine, Constantinople. These were all Christian cities. Remember the rise of Mohammed. The birth of Mohammed is in 622. We're talking about Constantine in the year 300. So it's a good 300 years before we have really the beginning of the Mohammedan religion with Mohammed. That's 300 years later. Now, what happens with the Muslims is phenomenal. In 100 years, they have the whole Middle East. But for up until that time, it's a very Christian area. And the great patriarchs of Antioch, Alexandria, and Constantinople. The term used is, these are the great patriarchates. And the term is used about Rome is, the Pope is the first among equals. Primus inter pares, the first among equals. Okay?
Father, wasn't the eastern part of the empire, and which didn't fall actually, Eastern Rome, over 1,000 to Muhammad, to Islam, but most of our doctrines, most of our faith, most of it was created in the eastern part, not in Rome itself, and not by the Pope himself.
Well, I'm not sure I'd say that.
Okay.
I mean, that's a very general statement that I'm not sure I would make. Because for instance, from the West, you have the great tomb of Leo. And yes, a lot of the earlier congregations are held in the East. Chalcedon, Nicaea, Constantinople. But to say that it came from the East, I'm not sure I would say that, because many of the bishops from the West, and they had a tremendous amount of impact. Okay? Yeah, the East is very important. I just would not quite go all the way with your statement. Yes? Who's trying to speak?
Somebody on the phone is trying to talk. Nope. Okay.
Yes.
Hi, Father Paul. I got kind of a Thomas question.
Okay.
If Hippolytanus and Pontius were banished to the salt mines, never to see the light of day, how did their story get out?
The story got out through other prisoners. For instance, if you were in the mines, many times, for instance, with Pontius, is he baptized one of the guards. And we know that. He, for instance, in his life, he baptized one of the guards. And that guard, you know, simply would have known a good portion of the story. But then also, when you had a better emperor, I'm being very general. Once you went to the salt mines, you might not ever get out. And for Pontius and Hippolytus, they never got out. But there might have been a reprieve on a better emperor. And some of them did get out of the salt mines. You know, it was just like with some of the stalags under the, Soviets, is you were stuck there for the rest of your life. But eventually, sometimes there was places where they were allowed to get out. Does that answer your question? But we do
Yes,
know,
thank you.
we do know, for instance, that Pontius baptized one of his guards.
Any other questions? Okay, somebody. Rosenthal, Isidore,
Yes, yes.
do you have a question?
No, I think Ellen's question was it. Thank
Okay.
you very much.
Great,
Thank you.
we're glad you're with us. Okay,
Yeah.
Karen? You have to unmute yourself.
Father, I was wondering if you could say more about what happened when Muhammad was born and in those about 600, and then what the relationship was like going on between that new religion and the Christians, all the way you were talking about the popes to about the year 1000.
Okay, well, very briefly, and this is something I'll take in greater depth in the next class. Muhammad comes from Arabia, and Arabia is an area of, their major religion is animism. And Muhammad rises, and it's meteoric. He suddenly arises, and the Arabs go on a conquest. If you take 622 as the date of his birth, by 732, they have conquered a good portion of the Middle East. Under their suzerainty is Iraq, Syria, what we call present day, Iraq, Syria, Israel, Jordan, Egypt, all of North Africa, and vast areas of Spain. In 732, it's 110 years, century plus 10, you have the Great Battle of Poitiers, where Charles Martel, the grandfather of Charlemagne, defeats the Moors on the outskirts of France, on the French-Spanish border. And he defeats them and prevents them from going any deeper into Europe then. So it's meteoric. And what they do, I mean, they have conquered this whole area. And there's something about the Mohammedan religion takes a great deal from the Old Testament and the New Testament. For instance, in the Mohammedan religion, Jesus is considered to be a prophet. And a lot of people, I don't know if you ever know this, there's a place in modern day Turkey, close to Ephesus, where you have the home of Mary. That's a place of pilgrimage, not only by Christians, but by Muslims. because Mary was the mother of the great prophet for them, Jesus Christ. Now, in the earlier years with the Arabs, they have this notion of conversion by the sword. Yet if you read the Quran, the Quran exempts all the people of the book. And the people of the book are Jews, Christians, and Muslims. They are people of the book who believe in one God. They're all monotheistic. And so they're referred to in the Quran as the people of the book. And so supposedly, there was to be no conversion by the sword of Christians or Jews. They are to be tolerated. And that is why, for instance, even to this day, a lot of people don't realize that Lebanon in the Middle East is half Christian, Maronite Christians. It's one of the oldest communities of Christians exists in Iraq. It was practically destroyed by this rising movement when the city, what was it, in Iraq. So the Christians were there, and they were always second class, but they've always been able to survive, and that's one of the wonderful things that I really respect about the Eastern churches. Now, one of the things, and I just make it very quickly, is the Muslim church is going to change tremendously. One of the people that is converted by the Arabs are the Turks. And when the Turks take over, the Muslim church becomes much, much more conservative, authoritarian. They make a big difference. When you read about the Arabs, Baghdad, for instance, Baghdad under the Arabs was a wonderful city, great university, and things like that. The Arabs produced great architecture and art. And unfortunately, there's a change in the Muslim church when the Turks take over. All right, I'm going to have to go, but thank you very much, and I will see you next week. Have a wonderful 4th of July. Be safe.
Thank you.
Father.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank
Love you,
you,
everybody.
Father.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If anybody wants any other Zoom help, contact me, and then I'll have Mary Ryan help you.
Now, Barbara has something to say. Do you have something you want to say?
No, I just want you to know that next week we're doing the fall of the Roman Empire and emergence of the church. So that should be great. And if you have any other questions, just hang on to them.
Thank you.
If you,
Barbara, did you say that you taped this portion of our lecture and it is available online?
we'll see. I tried to.
Okay.
I'll let you know. This is all.
Thank you. Thank you, Father, so much. And
Thank you, Father.
Thank you.
Thank you all, yes.
Okay.
Thank you,
Okay.
Barbara.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.